Great. All right, we'll likely have some more folks joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started so we have as much time as possible to learn together. I'm delighted to welcome you all back, to many of you, and a new welcome for anyone who is new to joining our After Survey Actions series. I am Dana Childress. I am the VP of our Leading Places to Work team. I am joined here by my wonderful colleague, Leah, who hopefully many of you have seen or have heard from as you've been engaging in some of your post-survey work. And also joined today by my colleague, our Chief Operating Officer, Mordy Walfish. I'm going to let him introduce himself more fully when he starts to get into his content for today, but we're just really excited that you all have dedicated an hour of your time on this afternoon to learn a little bit more about hiring practices. I'm going to just anchor us in where we are so far. So our After Survey Actions series, a reminder for some of you, but new for others, is something that we have put together this year to enable organizations who participated in the Employee Experience Survey to think about their data, engage with their consultants. We know many of you have engaged with your consultants. We've had over 75% of our organizations have had at least one conversation with a consultant, which we're really excited about. And through those conversations, we have unearthed a series of themes that we know that people are wrestling with and wanting to navigate in partnership with their teams. And one of those that continues to come up has been related to hiring. And so this is the second in a series this month in August that is part of the series, so that we can really hopefully give you all some tools and things to learn from to put into practice in your organization. So that is where we are here in this kind of overall roadmap after the survey. So in June and July, we focused really heavily on data and engagement and really understanding just your information that you were sitting with and figuring out how to move that forward, and had a couple of sessions related to sharing your data. Here in August, like I said, this is our second out of 3 sessions that we're doing on hiring and recruiting. For those of you who joined us last week, we were joined by partners at RCG Talent Solutions, and we really talked about kind of the big picture related to the recruiting and hiring spectrum and the different things that are involved in making sure that you are recruiting a diverse and comprehensive pool, and then doing a good job bringing those people to the finish line. And Mordy's going to take us through a bit of new content today, where we hear kind of what strong hiring practices are and how we have applied those specifically in our work at Leading Edge, and where we are excelling and where there's some things that we still have to learn, and really hopefully have more of a dialogue with you about those things. And just to kind of anchor us a bit in the data itself, because after all, this is about what we are actually seeing in the data. These are a few of the stats that we pulled from our aggregate Leading Edge data from the survey, which, as a reminder, is representative of over 320 organizations for the 2023 cycle. So this first one, there are enough people to do the work that we need to do. We heard 46% believe that to be true, and we know that that is really a felt experience for many of you who have reached out and feel that kind of the pace of work does not always feel sustainable. It is hard to reimagine the ways in which we are working post-pandemic and kind of just working in new ways. And so that feels challenging, and some of the different band-aids that people might have put into place are starting to fall off, and there needs to be new ways of operating. And so we see that really come through for folks. The second data point that we wanted to lift up is related to our current hiring practices are equitable, which 67% folks agreed that that was true for their organization. And as someone who's had a lot of conversations in the last year through our People Pro Collective about hiring processes, we know that people are really committed to this and are thinking about ways to try this on, whether it's through having hiring committees or having hiring partners even join their call for an interview, thinking about ways to make the job description more clear. So we see that there's just a ton of bright spots that are happening across the field. And we know that people are really hungry to have some more opportunity to learn and grow in this area. So we'll center on that a bit today. And then this last piece related to hiring and also related to many other things in the workplace, understanding how salaries and raises are determined at your organization, coming in at 41%. While that's not an explicit hiring data point, again, because it covers the whole employee life cycle, we know that most folks are operating in states where publishing the salary transparently is actually a requirement to hire. And so we'll share too, like how that has been part of our process at Leading Edge. So just wanted to kick us off with a bit of data to get our wheels turning for our conversation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mordy here.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really good to see some familiar faces and a whole bunch of new ones. And as Dana shared, I'm just going to be taking you through a little bit of, I would say, a case study of how basically what we have been learning at Leading Edge about hiring over the past 6 years or so, and just let's have a conversation. And I'm curious to hear also what's on your mind. What are you struggling with? Where do you feel like you're thriving that you can share with others on the call here? So as Dana mentioned, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Leading Edge. I've been at Leading Edge a little bit more than 6 years now. I was actually employee number 3, and we're about 24 at this point. And so my kind of vantage point on our hiring is very specific to the way in which we have grown also over the last number of years. So much of my role now is internal, and I love these opportunities to actually get out of my box and talk to folks outside the organization. And so really grateful for Lee and Dana for inviting me. I thought it would be helpful just to start off curiosity about a little bit who's in the room and how you interact with hiring. And so my colleague Leah is going to put up a couple polls, and just they're super easy and quick. Just invite you to share. How many hires does your organization tend to do in a year? Less than 5, 5 to 10, more than 10? And would you say that your hiring process enables you to get the job done? Yes, no, or kind of? Fascinating. Okay, love it. So it seems like we have a bunch of folks here who really do a lot of hiring throughout the year, like more than 10, and about a quarter of you do less than 5 or 5 to 10. So that's just really interesting to note, because I think also the volume of hiring that you do and also the size of your organization really impacts what you're able to do around hiring. And so we'll definitely talk about that throughout our time today. And it seems like most folks actually feel like their hiring processes kind of enable them to get the job done. So there's good news there. You don't feel like things are totally broken, and there's room for improvement. And so hopefully some of what I share today will be helpful and relevant to you. All right. So I think a lot of you know that we at Leading Edge, we think a whole lot about culture, and we know that culture is really shaped by the people that we have on our team. And so that means, at least for us, there is really a lot at stake in hiring. It's not just about finding, a random person with the best skills for the role. We're also always looking for someone who will play a positive role in shaping the culture of the organization. And I would say both for us, but also in the field writ large, we have definitely seen that hiring has been a bit of a challenge over the last couple of years, given all sorts of factors in and beyond the labor market. But part of my hypothesis is that there are things that we can each do, no matter what's happening in the outside market, that can actually really influence and improve both how we recruit and how we hire. As I shared, I was Leading Edge's third full-time employee, and we've grown eightfold since then. And I'll share that in our early days, we actually weren't great at hiring, which is obviously not good for our mission and for our work. And I think the biggest issue at the time was that we didn't really know what we were looking for. We were always hiring kind of for vague positions. We wanted, we use language like jack of all trades, someone who can, bob and weave, do everything, and realized that that's actually not a helpful way to hire. And we didn't actually have systems in our early days that helped us clarify what we were looking for and who we were actually aiming to hire. And so a couple of years ago, we really redesigned our whole hiring systems. And I would say that we've seen really strong results. Dana and Leah both came to us over the past few years with our new hiring processes. And I would say that we have seen a huge shift in terms of both the quality and the breadth of our candidate pool, but also, I think, really importantly, how people actually feel about the experience of going through this process with us. And it's great. Like, we actually hear sometimes from folks who were finalists but did not actually make it through, that they just appreciated the way in which they were held, communicated with, and treated throughout the process. And that is really important to us as well, because I think sometimes we forget that, throwing your hat in the ring can actually take a lot of courage. And especially when, for so many of us, work is entangled with our identity, with our sense of purpose. And so, again, like, for those who don't get a job with us, we want to make sure that they stay intrigued about working in the Jewish nonprofit world, and that they actually feel kind of better about themselves, not worse, after pursuing this opportunity. So I'd say the overall frame for how we, revisited our hiring processes is just looking at how do we want our recruitment and hiring to reflect our values. And one of our core values is really around kind of the humanity of every person. And so how might we humanize the recruitment and hiring process? So for us, that meant, clear and transparent communications. It means that candidates know what to expect, that we don't leave people hanging, that our equity principles are really baked into the process, and that the experience itself is actually useful to candidates. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you some of the important things that we've learned. And I want to acknowledge, of course, we are still learning. We are not perfect, and take this, as an example of what one organization, Leading Edge, has learned. Some of what I share may not be exactly applicable to your organization for a variety of reasons, but we can definitely talk that through in the Q&A. And also, this can be as conversational as you all would like. And so feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions or comments. I think Dana is going to be monitoring the chat, so just chime in as we go if you have questions. If you disagree vehemently with something that I share, I'm happy to talk that through. All right, so what did we learn? I would say this is sort of obvious, but it also feels really important to share that the first big thing that we learned is that candidates are really forming a strong impression of our culture in how we design and implement our hiring strategy, which meant that we really wanted to think carefully about the words that we use, how we communicate to the candidates, the tone, everything like that. So as I shared, like some of the concrete things that we do is we communicate a very clear timeline from the get-go and stick to it. So we say, this is when interviews are going to be taking place. This is when we aim to make the offer. This is our ideal start date. And of course, especially around start date, there's flexibility. But articulating from the get-go what the timeline is, I think also helps set expectations with the candidates around when they're going to hear back from you, and also just so that they can be understanding of when proactively they'll be getting that information and they're not waiting. We strive to have no more than 5 touch points with candidates, and really the goal there is to minimize the stress and burden. We do ask a lot of candidates, but we also want to be attuned to asking for it in a structured way, and also to really honoring their time. And another way that we do that is we pay finalists for their time if they're asked to do performance tasks, which usually the final 4 or 5 candidates are asked to do. Something else that has been really important to us is that we've been creating job postings with all the information. So we give people much more than maybe they even want to know about the job. So, in addition to all the basic details, is this full-time, is this part-time, location, skills, et cetera, we always specify the salary range in our job postings, which we know goes a long way towards equity and also just to ensuring that no one's time is wasted. And we also create an extensive FAQ, a frequently asked questions document for every single role. And we link that to the job posting. And this keeps all applicants informed. It democratizes access to information, and it also mitigates advantages for people who already know the organization. And so we share everything from, what does the day-to-day look like? What will success look like? What are the quirks of working with this person's supervisor? What might be challenging in the role? A little bit about where Leading Edge is in its life cycle as an organization. So as much as we can share, and even if we get questions throughout from candidates, we'll update the FAQ as we go, just again, so that everyone has access to the same information, whether you're the type of person that reaches out to ask a question or not, that no matter what, everyone has the same access. So that's really the first thing there. The second, which is also we realize incredibly important to us, is having internal clarity on the role. I would say both clarity and also buy-in on the role internally before you launch the process. Like, you really need to answer the question, why do we have this role? Why does this role matter? What will it uniquely contribute to the organization? Whether it's a new role or whether you're backfilling for an existing role, you always, I would say, need to articulate the why and make sure that everyone around you also understands that. And so for us, that really comes down to scoping out the job really clearly. Again, we try to have a strong sense, even down to percentage-wise, how's this person going to spend their time? Of course, knowing that in roles at most Jewish nonprofits, they shift, they evolve over time, but giving a sense of, at least to start with, what that role will look like, ensuring that the right people know about the hire and also have a chance to weigh in at the right level. And I think also remembering that as you're building out that job description, you're already preparing the ground for the employee's onboarding. And so we like to think a lot about the employee life cycle. So almost like think of the employee like a plant. Like, what can you do? What kind of ecosystem are you preparing for them to thrive in? And does your recruitment and hiring process reflect that? And so for us, when we think about scoping the job really clearly, we know that onboarding is incredibly important. We know that people want to know what their job is and what they're going to be asked to do and how success will be measured in the first 90 days in particular. And so that actually starts before the candidate, before you even start searching for the candidate. Any questions before I move on about any of that?
Yeah, I was going to surface a question I got, Morty, which was about whether we could share a sample of the types of questions we cover in an FAQ, which we can actually include in our follow-up. And I also had a question about the slides, so I just wanted to clarify for folks. So we'll send the slides and the recording tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that and don't feel like you have to furiously take notes. But Morty, maybe you could share just a couple samples of the types of FAQs that we have included.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can definitely share some samples of those. And I would say like some questions are questions that we include in every single job. So very much about the culture of leading edge. We call them the unwritten rules of success. And so like, what do people really need to know and do to be successful at leading edge? And others are very specific to the role. So everything like, what is this person's kind of home at the organization? Not only who their supervisor is, what their quirks are, but who else is on their team. We include the org chart also so that folks can see where this position fits into the broader. And also, is this a new role? Is this an existing role? But we'll definitely share a few examples so you can get a sense of the kinds of things that we ask. All right, so item number 3 that I'll share that we learned is that really in today's market, both parties hold power. I think oftentimes there's this sense in the hiring process that the hiring organization holds all the power, and that's really up to them to decide, who gets the privilege of working for them. There's definitely a component of that, but I would say, especially in today's market, both sides really hold power, and the position needs to work for everyone. And really thinking about it from the frame of mutual fit, I think also helps you kind of understand where your candidates are coming from in a different place, and also is just more honest, I think, in terms of the choice that exists. Dana referenced some of our employee experience survey data. We see we ask the question, like, do you intend to stay in your role in the next 2 years and in the sector as well? And we're seeing that a lot of folks are actually looking to shift away from their current roles. And so just understanding that in today's market, there is a lot of choice, even though actually at the moment, the market is taking a bit of a dip in terms of jobs. This piece feels really important to recognize as well. The fourth piece is something that I would say was a big cultural shift for us at Leading Edge, which is to highlight skills and not credentials. I'll say that back in the day, we used to have these kind of copy-paste qualifications where we're just like, they need a BA, they need a this, they need a that. And we actually forced ourselves to ask the question, like, is a BA required for this kind of job? Or is that something that is enabling this person to succeed in this role or not? And if the answer was no, or maybe not, we simply removed it. And so looking at the actual skills that folks need and what are the indicators of those skills, as opposed to just a generic credentialing, again, has been a huge shift for us, but also really important. And so we don't ask credentials like specific academic degrees or years of experience unless we actually need them. And there are some roles, again, that require them and some do not. And we found that this has actually really helped us broaden our pool, broaden access to our candidate pools, and has encouraged folks who might not otherwise have applied to really apply as well. And something else that I would say has been really important to us in recruiting is just to cast like a massively wide net. A lot of folks come to us and say, like, where is the one place that is going to make the difference to me in hiring? And unfortunately, the way that people operate today, there just isn't one. There's no silver bullet to recruiting. And I would say, like, you need to work all the networks possible and advertise in a range of places that you can actually find that unexpected candidate who you might not otherwise find. I would say to get the most quality and diversity into our pools, we post our opportunities in kind of all the usual places, LinkedIn, idealist.org, some major job aggregators like Career Hub, which our friends at JPro run. There's also Hire Black Initiative, which has sent a lot of great candidates our way. And for each recruitment, we also mobilize all the staff to really spread the word to their network. So trying to go at it from both ends. And the piece around networking is a really fascinating and interesting one, because on the one hand, we do know that a lot of folks do get their jobs through networks, and that who is better to know what your organization needs than your current employees. So that's like one truth that we hold on one hand. And on the other hand, we don't want to create an unfair advantage for people we know. And we also know that actually limits the diversity of your candidate pool. And so we try to really balance that by, again, casting a wide net and asking everyone to mobilize their networks. But if someone reaches out to a staff member and asks to chat about a role or say, can you please put in a good word for me? The answer there is actually no. And again, that's for us is to create equity across the process. We do allow staff and other stakeholders to share thoughts about candidates in the very, very final stage. But I would say, even if I have someone great in mind for this role, we still absolutely post the role. We go through a process. We consider that person among other candidates. And that way, we're not only alleviating bias, but we're also ensuring that we actually find the person who's the best fit for the role. And actually going through that process might yield new learnings for you about what you're actually looking for. And so that feels really important as well. Any questions about that piece? All right, the final point on this slide is, at least for us, for most roles, we have said goodbye to cover letters. Many organizations, as we know, do require cover letters, and they judge applicants based on how well they write them, even if writing letters has actually nothing to do with the job itself. So instead of cover letters, we actually have each candidate submit a video introduction, which lets them show, other forms of intelligence, a little bit about their personality, and at least we find gives a more multidimensional picture of applicants. Of course, if writing is an important component of the role, through the performance task at the end of the process, we will test for that and we will look at that. But we have found that cover letters, at least in today's day, have become so generic, copy-pasty. Definitely in the world of AI, there's a danger that the person might not have actually written that cover letter. And so for us, again, if we're thinking about how are we actually going to assess this candidate based on what we're looking for? At least for us, we found that cover letters have not fit the bill. And so we no longer require them. And actually, when candidates do submit cover letters, we don't even look at them because, again, we're trying to access the same information from all candidates. All right. On our next slide, we have really so much of the way in which hiring process proceed, of course, is through the interviewing process. And so I want to share a little bit about kind of what we've learned and what we're doing right now around interviewing. The first piece that I just want to name is that bias is absolutely inevitable. That is part of being human. And there are structural ways throughout the process that there are ways to mitigate that. And that is what we strive to do. So both, I would say, being upfront about what our biases are. And when we form a hiring committee, which is what we do really as a way to avoid groupthink, we have folks even talk about what their biases are, like how they tag certain people based on either things that are conscious to them or not yet conscious to them. And we found that even at the very least, having that conversation has made people more aware and open to really checking those biases. So as I said, we usually form a hiring committee as a way not only to avoid groupthink, but also just to ensure that we get different perspectives from across the organization in terms of the person's role within the organization, also the demographics, and just ensuring that a number of people are allowed to weigh in. It's not just up to the hiring manager themselves. And we actually found that having hiring committees has the secondary effect of, first of all, just letting people from across the organization work together on a common goal in a different way. But it also is part of that kind of ecosystem preparation for the candidate. So once someone is actually hired, they already have a few different familiar faces, not just their hiring manager. And it kind of helps speed up their integration into the culture as well. So the way that we do our hiring committees is that each team member really reviews each candidate separately. They evaluate them on a rubric without knowing what other people think. And then only after each person evaluates the candidate separately do we talk about them together. And we're also clear that the role of the hiring committee is to make a recommendation to the hiring manager, but it is actually up to the hiring manager to decide whether to move someone along in the process or not. So that also helps. It's not necessarily, we don't vote democratically. The hiring committee, which is usually, I would say, 3 to 5 people, they share all of their thoughts on the candidate, and the hiring manager makes an educated decision based on that. Something that is also really important to us at Leading Edge is having structured interviews. So basically ensuring that the interview questions are consistent for all candidates and that we evaluate their answers based on our prepared rubrics. And again, that is to minimize bias and allow for the best apples to apples comparison of candidates. And we know that research has really shown that Structured interviews with evaluation on predetermined criteria are actually much better predictors of future performance than kind of improvised conversations, like seeing where the conversation goes, things like that. And we also know that keeping all the interviews close together in time, within 1 or 2 days, also helps reduce what's called recency bias. So either preferring or specifically not preferring the last candidate you saw. We find that if an interview process unfolds over the course of weeks, months, which sometimes does happen, it's really, again, it's not an apples to apples comparison, and definitely diminishes the process. Rubrics are definitely your friend here. When we know the skills and the traits that we need, we put them together into a rubric and we evaluate candidates based on that rubric, not on kind of random feelings or reactions that we have. And I would say that actually forces the hiring committee and the hiring manager to kind of put meat on the bones there. It keeps us away from phrases like, this person's not a cultural fit, or my gut tells me so, such and such, which are, really ways of just staying trapped in bias and vagueness. And so by really forcing the hiring committee to put evidence, like what did you witness here that is leading to this certain rating that you have, that again is a way that we strive to create equity throughout the process. I already kind of shared this, but super important, I would say, to be clear on who the decision maker is. And for us, the hiring manager is the decision maker until the final stage of the process. So the hiring committee, they weigh in, they have a voice, but not a veto. And then at the very end of the process, the CEO has the opportunity to meet and potentially veto any finalists. So we always keep promising folks warm just in case, if not for this role, then for a future potential role. But that's also something that our CEO still feels, given our organizational size, she would like to meet with all candidates before they're accepted, just as a way both to show like this is the kind of organization where you have access to the CEO, that you talk to the CEO cares, you're not just like a random cog in our machine here, but also so that they can use their own rubric to assess the extent to which this person will be a culture add to the organization. Finally, of course, like in that vein, keep in mind that this person will be shaping your culture. So culture is something that exists as people come and go, but is also very much shaped by the people that you have on board. And so something that I've learned, I would say, throughout the process is to just be attuned to red flags that you see from the outset. And at the same time, don't let your biases get in the way of those red flags. See what you might learn. Like, for example, we've had candidates in the past that have not been as responsive necessarily as we would have liked to see. And instead of saying, you are not eligible for this role anymore, we inquire, is something going on? And it turns out, like for this specific person, they were going through some really tough stuff with their family. There were some technology challenges, and we kept them in the process. We mitigated that. So on the one hand, we're like, ooh, they don't necessarily communicate in a way that we would like, but we're going to inquire as to why that might be the case. And again, that feels aligned with our values, looking at the whole person and not just making assumptions based on what we might see. That was a lot. I think maybe we'll take down the slides, and I really just want to open it up for Q&A, thoughts, questions, see what's resonating, what isn't, what's feeling applicable to your organizations, what's not, and we can have a conversation.
I have two different kinds of thoughts, Marty. Really great stuff. So thank you. Already really good ideas. So I appreciate all of your knowledge. My question is sort of not maybe really a question, but I'm shocked to hear that you have that many candidates for each position that you actually have. Because I found in the last 2 years, we've been kind of just getting barely the right person coming through, or waiting over a 5-month period to get 2 candidates and hoping that, or not hiring at all, because we're not just hiring if we don't find the right people.
Mm.
So is that the case, that you have been getting, the process you're using is catching a lot of candidates?
I would say we've been very fortunate. For every open position in the last few years, we've had, depending on the role, between 50 and 250 applicants. So we definitely have quite a bit of choice. It might be, again, like part of these processes, it might be, leading edge is still like new kid on the block-ish. We have a good reputation. People want to work for us. I don't know, Leah and Dana, what else you're seeing there, but we definitely like casting the wide net and mobilizing our networks we have found yields a really strong candidate pool.
Are you also all remote? I see two of you at
We
home.
are.
Are you all remote?
We're all at home in different
Okay.
places. So that
Yeah.
we know that
Okay.
that helps. And I think that's like
Absolutely.
very important to acknowledge, Miriam. And I would say like your experience is like not unique. Like we have definitely heard that sourcing is the #1 challenge. And we talked about this a bit with some of our partners last week as well. And so, yeah, I think org type, like remote flexibility, like, and then I was going to start to put a bit that like not all of those applicants are like rigorous, like high quality candidates. Like that's like the actual traffic. And then we're obviously like narrowing that down and starting with a much smaller pool of folks that we think are likely to meet the bar and like go through the process. The one kind of the biggest shift I've seen from people, I would say both in the Jewish nonprofit sector and outside, my background is in the social sector, but at an education nonprofit, is that people are posting and then just not seeing any traffic, and like the shift in having to be much more proactive and doing like direct outreach. Like I joke a little bit about like I got this job sent to me by 3 to 4 people when I was looking for a job. And I thought, I was like, oh, I should probably apply for that job. There's something here where people are seeing some connection. And I thought that meant that Leading Edge had also done a good job of like mobilizing a lot of different like people who weren't even necessarily like 1 degree removed from Leading Edge. Like I got it from other people, which I just think is interesting as we think about having to build a bench longer term, right? But it's hard because people mostly focus on hiring when it's acute. And when it's acute, you're already drowning because you have a vacancy. So it's this vicious cycle. So I just want to like affirm that and say that, I mean, I think if there are times when you're kind of in like the off season where you can be doing more of that like networking and helping people better understand your like org value proposition, like that's time well spent when you do in fact have an opening.
Yeah, I see, Hallie, your comment as well. And you're right. Like we definitely, I would say in terms of, this is just a truly back of the envelope, but probably only 5 to 10% of our candidate pools are actually candidates who we would think of as qualified for the role. Part of that is we only discover that throughout the process. Of course, there's like a weeding out that happens, but for us, it really depends on the role. For example, more operations focused roles tend to, of course, garner more candidates, whereas content roles, fewer. And again, that makes sense. I think Leah points to also organization type playing a big role here. That's huge. We also find that the more senior the role, the fewer qualified folks we get as well. And I think that's, again, just the nature of the landscape at the moment.
Thank you.
Miriam, did you have a second piece or did we cover both?
No, you covered it beautifully. Thank you.
I think, David, you had a question.
Hi, 2 questions. One, I'm curious how, if you have any thoughts rather on posting positions internally before posting them externally to allow people inside opportunity for growth. And then a small caveat to that is if you have employees that are contractors that want to maybe come on full time. And then the second question is, my God, I totally just forgot. Oh, yeah, no. As an organization that is growing, like tips and thoughts on like, and this might be a different session, how to navigate like what is the right next position, versus like this is what we have funding for that might be targeted, but it's not necessarily the next right hire.
Oof. Juicy questions for sure.
Sure.
I will share that it is definitely best practice to have an internal hiring process. And it's something actually that Leading Edge just put into place over the last few months. And again, I would say the most important thing there is having a process and not just saying like, hey, like if anyone, just again, having a process that is articulated, that has its own timeline within the broader timeline, and that all the principles that you're executing externally, you execute internally as well around transparent communication, around the skills required, et cetera. For us, it also feels important to ensure that we are aligned with an internal candidate around whether their current supervisor is aware of that or not. And we try to take the lead from the candidate, but it is ideal if there is alignment internally that this is something that the internal candidate is, or that a staff member internally is interested in, and that is taken into account as well, just because it is part of the dynamic. And so I think, again, it depends on the size and type of organization. I would say if we had tried to do that a few years ago, it would have felt a bit silly, just given how small we are, but given where we are now, that does feel important. I know Dana or Leah, if you want to add anything there.
Yeah, I was just placing something in the chat. I agree with that. The other piece I was just going to say, since we did talk about hiring committees, I think that's just like an important thing to be very thoughtful about if people are going to step in front of peers. I ran an executive director fellowship in my last role, so it was mostly internal candidates. And even when people are like trying to be neutral, like it's just awkward. Like there's not like a lot of ways around that, but how do you kind of orient or onboard people into that experience to make sure you're like preserving confidentiality and candidate experience for your employees, just as you would an outside candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. And we default to confidentiality because we know that people throw their hats in the ring before. They might be ready, they might just be exploring if you're a passive candidate, an active one. So there's a lot to consider there. Your next question was basically around workforce planning, right? Like how do you determine how to staff your workforce? And I wish there were an easy formula for this. I mean, the textbook answer is look at your strategic plan, see what your goals are, assess the extent to which your staff is enabling you to achieve those goals, and assess where the gaps are and hire around those. In actuality, I think we know, and we definitely experience this at Leading Edge, in the early days, one or more people are playing multiple roles. And oftentimes, I would say decisions around new roles get made for idiosyncratic reasons. For example, my position, when I was hired at Leading Edge, I was hired as deputy director because the board was worried that our CEO was going to burn out. And they said, you need a, and so that was it wasn't necessarily like we have a plan. There was no strategic plan, honestly, at the time. It was, we think you're doing good things. You are going to burn out. Hire someone that can take some of the burden off and serve as your proxy as needed. And that's not necessarily best practice, but that's how it unfolded. And I think that's kind of natural. And then over time, it's like I built this operations department that has its own vertical, and we become much more structured and set. And so I think part of it is you do need to be attuned to the humans. Like, are people working multiple jobs? Do you have a big need around communications? Do you have a big need around development? And I think funding is a consideration there as well. It is important to remember, if you're hiring for funding dependent positions, to also be upfront with the candidate about that. And I think sometimes if there isn't that alignment, then candidates can be either misled or disappointed. And sometimes you'll want to keep that person no matter what, but other times that's not the case. And so it can be tricky. Those are a bit of kind of rambly thoughts. I'm curious, does anybody else have ideas about that? It's a huge and really important question, I would say. Rachel, I'll tell the board that you said that. They are very human focused, for better and worse, I would say.
That's like the best reason to hire a second in command that I've ever heard.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting. And that was like part, like it was very explicit throughout the process too. And I was like intrigued by that. But it's an interesting thing to be told that you're being hired to be someone's proxy. And when I look at my original job description, it was, on the one hand, like it was like 10 pages, and the other hand, it was just like, do the things, basically. And I think I was excited about that, but that would definitely not work for anyone that wants maybe more structure already set when they start. What else is on people's minds? Rachel, yeah.
Since there is a pause in the questions, could I ask something that's only tangentially related?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's apparently how my brain works anyway. This was kind of like just pinged in my brain when you were explaining the point that I think maybe I've heard Dana express before about when asked to put in a good word for a candidate, the answer is actually no. Here's why: for equity reasons. I'm assuming that answer could also apply when an organization is asked to do the same for like a former volunteer, or I mean a former employee or a current volunteer, in regards to a job they might be looking for in another community or with a partner agency? I feel like the answer would work for the same reasons, even though it's a different situation. But does anyone see any like red flags with that logic? Um,
Sounds like you're asking a bit more about like reference checking. Is that?
Yeah.
Sort of like the pre-reference checking, like when someone's looking
Yeah.
at a job and is like, oh, you might know this CEO. Can you put in a good word for me?
Yeah.
Got it.
I mean, I will personally say I just don't like backdoor reference checks on either end for like a variety of reasons. I think they can be very risky. Like from a hiring perspective, I think they're risky because it's like you're starting to ask the circle of person to tell their circle they're looking. That's like a very basic confidentiality piece. I think then the next, very important layer around equity and just giving people a chance to like put their impression forward for this role. Like maybe they weren't great at operations 5 years ago, but like they're really good at it now. And it's a different context and a different manager. Like that to me feels like very shaky. I think and I think on the flip side, I tend not to do that for people, but I'm always happy if I've had a like actual like, kind of substantive relationship with people. I am often people's references and I'm more than happy to give like a very thorough, like, please use me as your reference. And like, should you make it to that stage? I go back and forth on this like bigger picture piece around equity, which is like, you don't want to give people an unfair advantage. And I actually feel like sometimes we're not giving people, if they're like working outside the field, like I'll just use us as like an example. If there are people that have been working outside of the field and we're actively trying to bring in like new voices, like for like any number of reasons, like they're not going to know the like right things to say. Like they haven't worked with certain organizations. And so that might not play well in the interview process. And that feels challenging to me. So I'll just name like, I think it's complex and there's a tension for me there. Like I have some folks who I've been like, oh, I don't think you've thought about working in the Jewish nonprofit sector. I want to give you like a primer on what that looks like, so that you can enter into the interview process like on a level playing field, but that actually requires like a networking conversation, right? So like, I don't know, I'm naming like, I think it is a tension and one that I haven't fully resolved for myself, but on the kind of piece around like giving people an opportunity to make a first impression, like that part feels clear to me. It's still like having the informal conversation sometimes to me that feels a little bit tricky. I don't know if Morty would add anything or others would.
Yeah, I do think
disagree.
like the later you get in the process, like we do like want, for example, like red flags. If you worked for someone and they have toxic tendencies, like that is actually something that we want to know, not on the front end, but if they make it for further along in the process. Sherry, you asked a great question in the chat around reference checks. What are our thoughts on those? Are they becoming obsolete? I would love to have a conversation on that because I don't feel like I have a fully formed perspective there. On the one hand, it does feel important to get someone else's assessment in terms of this candidate and to hear more about what their experience is. On the other hand, it's like very silly because you're sort of like hacking the system, right? Like you are offering people that, it's part of the social contract, basically, that for the most part, people just say this person was wonderful. I do think when you probe around, what are some growing edges, you often do get some useful things. Our frame around reference checks is very much around like questioning or not questioning assumptions that we have. Like I've experienced as candidate as strong in this regard and weak in this regard. Does that line up with your experience of working with them? So being very specific. And also something that I have found in reference conversations that help to create more of an open conversation is to share that the frame is very much around, I want to know what I can do as this person's manager to set them up for success. So what can you teach me about working with them? What are the unwritten rules of working with this person? And I find that actually brings, as opposed to that person feeling like, their mentee, their livelihood is dependent on this conversation. So they're just going to say they're perfect. So creating kind of that space. Yeah, and Dana put in the chat, definitely the more folks you ask, the better. I know a lot of organizations are moving towards asking more than 3. David, yeah.
Can I ask another question if nobody else has anything? I don't want to crowd the space, but okay. Mordy, I was wondering if you had talked about exercises and some of, positions that you have them do and you compensate people for that. One, I was curious if there's information you guys can send after, or you can share now on like just what those exercises look like, and then what kind of compensation looks like for that. And then another question about salary bands. We're talking about that where I work, which I know you know, Morty. But in kind of just, I feel like a little bit we're backing into it, but just any thoughts? We don't have them, but we want to have them, but people are kind of all over the place in terms of salaries.
Mm-hmm. So on the second, there's this great guide on the Leading Edge website of how to create transparent and equitable compensation bands. And definitely happy to talk about that offline. We went through a process about 1.5 years ago. Leading Edge to do that. A lot of folks end up working with consultants if they want to kind of get rigorous market data. And it also, I think, requires you as an organization to decide some values questions, like at what place in the market do you want to pay your employees? Like we decided that we want to pay our employees 75 to 100% of the market for that certain position. And so again, that's a question. Your first question, I'm blanking. Remind me.
Exercises during the interview.
Exercise, yes. I mean, the basic frame around performance tasks, as we call them, is really trying to, instead of, interviews, you see how people talk and think and articulate. And these actually enable you to see how people work. And so when you look at what are the core competencies of the jobs or even types of things that this person might do in the job, the sense is that with a performance task, you're able to develop an impression of that. And then again, we have a rubric that we base that on. We do pay, it's not a huge amount. We pay candidates $125 for their time. And that's basic. And it's not like even broken down by, we think this will take you X amount of hours. It's basically an acknowledgement that we know you have a lot going on in your life. We are asking you to do something that is actually helping us. It might help you a little bit, but it's really helping us assess whether you're the best fit for this role. And so we want to acknowledge that that's placing some kind of burden on you. And some organizations, they actually have bands for performance tasks. Like if it's an assistant level, we pay this. For us, it's just no matter what role, we'll pay the same amount. And I would say it's both symbolic, but also I think shows the candidate again that we're not asking for volunteers here, where this is work. Love these questions. They're really, really helpful. I don't know, Dana, Leah, anything that you feel like I've missed or that you feel like we do that I haven't really touched on?
I have a question. As I listened to you share, I was thinking about what a long process it must have been to shift how we hire at Leading Edge, and if there was anything that was hard for people to adopt. Like, was there any piece of this process that sort of like took some coaxing or bringing people along?
Yes, great questions. I would say in the first vein, like it absolutely was a process, and I don't think I named this, but we hired a firm to not only like redesign our processes, but to actually run a few searches that I and a couple other teammates participated in so that we could learn from them what they were doing. And that was actually, I think, through your hire, Dana, if you recall. And there we were like weaning ourselves from their support, but it was actually important for us that like we watched them operate and they're like best in class in all sorts of ways. Let me think. So I would say a couple, like honestly, the cover letter piece was a little bit controversial. And I think it's just because that required like, oh, that's like a whole new, it's a whole new thing. And I think so many of us were just used to like this being a part of that. I think the limiting the touch points to 5 and being meticulous about that was also hard for some folks that wanted to be like, oh, I just want to ask them like just a few more questions, or maybe they should talk to this person. I'm like, no, we said they're only talking to these people. We need to be clear on that. Although I'm actually recalling, Dana, in your process, you definitely talked to more people than were initially indicated. And so I think you saw just some of those tensions play out in real time of like, hiring is so important. We want to make sure that this person is the right person. And so this person needs to weigh and that person needs to weigh and that person needs to, and balancing that with kind of our commitment. I would say we don't even follow our own medicine 100% of the time. And I think for like good and important reasons, but even sometimes there is that dimension of things. And I think also, I don't think people push back on the rubrics, but some people feel like some people want to trust their gut, and some people want to be in that place of just like, I know what I like, I know, and like just these are humans, and I know how I interact with humans. There's a sense that like rubrics turn it too much into like a robotic automated process, which I don't think is the case personally, but I think some folks feel maybe that it makes it overly scientific, and it's like everyone gets reduced to like their rating out of 100, and that how can you possibly encapsulate a human being in a rubric? And so of course we try to bridge that with conversation and other forms of assessment, but I would say that those have been like the major pieces of attention.
I love those, Mordy. Two things I would layer on for like moving to these kind of, I would say, slightly more like comprehensive processes. Like it's just a big time investment, and it might not be right for every hire. I think it was Hila, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, or Hila, in the chat, he was asking if we do the hiring committee for every role. And I actually didn't do a comprehensive hiring committee for Leah's hire. This is all very meta as we're talking about our own hiring processes on this call. But just because of what was like on my plate at the time, and we had a transition, but what I was trying to bubble up is what am I hoping to get from this? And I wanted to have another read. So I had co-interviewers and I had other folks involved, but I didn't do kind of the formality of a true hiring committee. And so I would just, encourage people, if you want to try this on, maybe you do it for, one hire, and then you can kind of iron out, what's working for you in terms of processes. Big on like managing up and like holding time in people's calendars. Like if people are going to meet with your executive team, like literally like, kind of looking out, people will say like, I want this person hired immediately. And then they're like out of the office for the next 3 weeks. Like I've seen that happen many times. And so how do you kind of just balance the reality of like day-to-day work and wanting to have more engagement and investment in the hiring process? Those are kind of like two sides of the same coin. And I think the other piece that actually helps with limiting the touch points is like just getting more precise over time with what things you actually need to know from people that are predictive for success in that role. So I did see that a lot of folks hire multiple people like throughout the course of the year. And if there's like you're hiring similar roles, like are there certain things that you're seeing are like really crucial for success in that role that you can actually boil down and say like when people have this type of prior experience they're really successful, or actually they need to like be onboarded in these ways? And I think that will help. You might not get to like a true like predictive model, right? Like we're not robots, but if you're like, I always look for X kind of skill when I'm hiring for someone to work with the board, like that will just make your process easier from a sourcing perspective, and then easier to like be very narrow in the questions that you ask over time. So I think it is just you like refine your process with each hire. It gets like a little bit stronger, has been my experience, but also like, sometimes you can't do all of these things because like the need is real in terms of your workflow. Awesome. And thanks to Leah for dropping our survey form in the chat. I almost forgot. We love feedback, you all. Please take a couple minutes to just fill out that form. We'll also send it in the email tomorrow with our slides and with this recording, but we ask that you take a couple minutes and tell us what's working for you as we continue to build additional content. So I'll quickly highlight what's coming up. We have one more session that is on hiring practices. This will be a peer consultancy model, which is something new that we're trying with this year's After Survey Action Series. If you want to come to that, it is on Monday, August 28th. Look for that registration link in your inbox, and that will be one where you should bring a specific hiring challenge that you are excited to discuss in small groups. So more participatory than some of the webinars that we have done. In September, we are going to have a couple sessions that are focused on compensation, which we know always feels very live for people and surfaced a bit even on this call. And we are going to do for the first time a session on sharing survey results with the board. So if you're somebody who works directly with your board and is thinking about how to bring them into talent and culture, we invite you to join us for that session as well. So thank you all for being here, and just huge gratitude to Mordy for coming and sharing some of what we're learning, and really appreciate the conversation today.